And then during the time of the vow of the Nazirite, you would not drink any wine, nor would you cut your hair. And whatever time that you had established for commitment and consecration, when that time was over, then you would come again to the priest, they would shave you, burn the hair again upon the altar, and it was the end of the Nazirite vow. With Samson, the Lord declared he was to be a Nazirite unto God from his birth. In other words, his life was to be completely consecrated to the Lord. And the Lord said that he would, through him, begin to deliver the Israelites from the oppression of the Philistines. And so she ran home and told her husband that this person of awesome countenance appeared to her, told her that she was going to have a son, and that he was not to have his hair cut, and that he was not to drink any wine, and God was going to use him. And the husband was a little suspicious. He said, "What did the fellow look like?" He said, "Well, it's pretty awesome." And he said, "Well, if ever he shows up again, let me know." So as she was working out in the field again, once again the angel appeared to her. So she said, "Would you mind waiting here? I need to get my husband." So she ran and got her husband and said, "He's here again, he's here." And so he came out. When he saw the angel of the Lord, he just sort of passed it off. He said, "Well, she was so excited, I wanted to get it straight from you. What are we supposed to do now with this boy?" And the angel said, "Just like I told her, he's not to have any wine or strong drink. He's not to have any razor come to his head. He's to be a Nazirite unto God from birth." So in the specified time, Samson was born. And as he grew up, the Spirit of God began to come upon him, and it was manifested with tremendous strength. And God's Spirit would just come upon him, and he had such great strength with God's Spirit upon his life. And so one day he wandered down the valley to the Philistine city of Timnath. And there he saw a cute little Philistine girl and had a big crush on her, came back and said to his dad, "Dad, saw a little gal down in Timnath, and I want you to go down and arrange for me to marry her." In those days, marriage was by arrangement. And the fathers would get together and they would haggle over a price for the daughter. And the groom's father would then more or less pay the price, certain number of camels, certain number of sheep, certain number of shekels of silver, whatever. And in reality, it was what you might refer to as alimony in advance. In those days, women really didn't have any rights. The fellow could put away his wife anytime he desired. All he had to do is said, "I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you," hand her a paper, and she had to get out. And because she had no rights, while the fellow was still all excited wanting to marry her is when they would make the deal, and the dad would have to pay, as I said, alimony in advance, because if she had to go back to her dad, then he had the money to take care of her, because he was to keep that money in trust to take care of her should she ever return home. So when Samson asked his dad to make the arrangements, his dad said, "Oh, come on, Samson, look around here, a lot of cute little Israeli girls. Why would you want to get him, involved with a Philistine?" And Samson said, "Hey, Dad, don't give me a bad time. Just go and do what I ask you to do." So Samson and his parents went on down to Timnath, and on the way down, you have to remember now that this was a wooded area at that time. There was a lion that came out, and Samson grabbed the lion, ripped the thing in two, tossed the carcass in the bushes, and his parents were ahead of him. He caught up with him, and by that time he was sort of a keep it to yourself kind of a guy. And he didn't even tell him what had happened, his attack of the lion and all. And so they went on down to Timnath. They made the arrangements. They agreed upon the price for the daughter. Came on back, but then the time came that they had set for the wedding. And they headed back down to Timnath again, the family. in order for the wedding ceremony. At this time, his parents again ahead on the path. Samson, when he got to the place where he had tossed the lion's carcass over in the bush, was a little curious as to, what had come of it. Gals wouldn't understand this, but guys would, to just see the rotting carcass and the maggots and so forth. And as he came to the carcass of the lion, he saw that the bees had made a hive in it. And so he took some of the honey out of the hive and caught up to the parents and gave them some of the honey. And again, didn't tell them anything about it, just, got some honey out of a beehive. And they went on down for the wedding. Well, in those days, weddings were a little different than they are in the present day. I mean, it was a real ceremony. It lasted for a week. And they would appoint a certain number of fellows to be with the groom, a certain number of gals to be with the bride, and it was party time, sort of your last days of freedom before getting married. And so they appointed 30 young Philistine fellows to be Samson's buddies and partners in the partying. And so Samson said to these Philistine fellows, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a riddle, and if you can solve the riddle, I'll give you 30 shirts and 30 changes of clothes. If you can't solve the riddle by the time the wedding comes, then you owe me 30 shirts and 30 changes of clothes. They said, you're on, man. What's the riddle? And he said, out of the eater came forth sweetness. And they said, out of the eater came forth sweetness? What's that all about? He said, that's the riddle. Figure it out. So the guys were trying to figure it out, and they just weren't getting anywhere. So they came to the bride-to-be, and they said, you set us up as suckers. You put us with this guy, and now he gives us a riddle, and what you were trying to do is just get a good wardrobe for him before you got married, and you made patsies out of us, and we don't appreciate it. And so you better find out what the riddle is and tell us, or else we're going to burn down your old man's house. And so she came to Samson and she said, honey, you've given a riddle to these guys and you haven't even told me. And, we're going to get married and you never should have secrets from each other. And so what is the riddle? He said, hey, figure it out. He said, I haven't even told my parents what it is, And so she started crying every day. She'd look at him and he'd look at her and she'd be sniveling and saying, you don't really love me. If you love me, you'd tell me. And so finally, she just wore him down, and he told her, he said, well, I killed a lion, and out of the lion's carcass I got honey. Out of the eater came forth sweetness. And so she went ahead and told the Philistines. And so the time for the wedding had come, and so Samson said, okay, fellas, what is it? And they said, what is stronger than a lion, and what is sweeter than honey? And he got angry. He said, you've been plowing with my heifer. And if you hadn't plowed with my heifer, you'd have never figured it out. And so he went on down to Ashkelon, one of the Philistine cities. There he got hold of 30 Philistines, killed them, took their clothes, and brought them back and paid off his debt, came back home. After a while, a couple of weeks, he cooled off, decided to go down and visit his wife. When he got down there, the dad wouldn't let him go into the bedroom. And Samson said, what do you mean? And, I married her, paid you for her. And he said, oh, no, when you took off, you were so mad, I figured you'd never come back. So I let the best man marry her. We were all set with the party and everything. We went ahead with the wedding, but, the best man is now her husband. And so Samson said, okay, I'll get even. And he went out and he smote the Philistines, came on back and was up here on the hill of Etah, which is on up just a little ways from here, and Etam. And as he was up there, just sort of kicking back, the Philistines sent a regiment to get him. And so as the Philistines came on up, the men of Judah came out and they said, what are you guys doing? What's your big problem? I mean, we're not fighting with you. And they said, we want Samson. And if you deliver Samson to us, no problems. But if you don't, You got big problems. So they came to Samson and said, Samson, man, you're giving us a bad time. You know that we're serving the Philistines, and now you've got them all upset and angry with us, and they want to fight. And we don't want to fight with them, and they want us to turn you over to them. Samson said, I'll make you a deal. I'll let you tie me up and turn me over to them if you promise that you won't turn on me yourself. They said, we won't turn on you. We don't have anything against you. So they tied up Samson, turned him over to the Philistines. And Samson saw there a jawbone of a donkey. He picked it up, and he began to smite the Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey, just dumping their body into heaps, until finally he looked around and he said, heaps upon heaps. Behold, I've killed 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. And then, of course, he was thirsty, and God gave him to drink out of the donkey's jawbone. But then he went on down to the Philistine city of Gaza. And there he went into a harlot's house. And the Philistines said, hey, Samson's here in our town. Bar the gates tonight. When he goes to leave, the gates will be barred, and in the morning we'll kill him. So the Samson at midnight decided to go home, came to the city gates, found them barred, just picked up the gates, put them on his shoulders, carried them off all the way over near Hebron, where he just dumped them. And the next day, when the Philistines came out to ambush him, they found the gates of the city gone, had to send guys clear on over near Hebron to bring them back. And then in the valley of Sorek, this valley here, there was this Philistine gal by the name of Delilah, and Samson fell in love with her. And the Philistine lords came to Delilah, and they said, look, we will each of us give you 1,100 pieces of silver if you will find out for us the secret of that fellow's strength. And so Delilah began to say to Samson, Samson, you're so strong. It's amazing. What is the secret of your strength? Samson said, well, if they would tie me up with 7 green vines, I would be weak like anybody else. They've always tied me up with dried vines. Anybody can snap dried vines. If you would use the green vines, I'd be helpless. So she said, well, why don't you take a little nap, honey? Just lie here on my lap and relax a bit. And as soon as he was asleep, she called in the Philistines, and they bound him with 7 green vines. She said, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And he jumped up, and the vines popped off like they were threads hit with a blowtorch. And he went out and did his thing on the Philistines and came back in, and she said, oh, Samson, you didn't tell me the truth. You were just lying to me, weren't you? She said, but really, what is the secret of your truth, of your strength? And what is the truth about it? And he said, well, if they would tie me up with 7 new ropes. They've always used old ropes. If you'd use the new ones, I'd be weak like any other man. Well, honey, why don't you take a little nap, just relax and so forth. And called in the Philistines, tied him up with the 7 ropes. And she said, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And he jumped up, and the ropes popped off. And so she said, oh, you're a big joker, aren't you? You're just playing games with me. You're just not really telling me the truth. But tell me, Samson, what is the secret of your strength? He said, well, if you would take the 7 locks of my hair, and if you would weave them in the loom, I'd be weak like any other man. And so she said, well, sweetie, why don't you just take a little nap, rest a bit, and she had them weave the locks of his hair into the loom. She said, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And he jumped up and took the loom and the weaver's beam and everything else. And so she started to cry. She said, I really thought you loved me, but you're just playing games with me. You don't love me. You're not telling me the truth at all. And that old tear bit, and finally it got to Samson. And he said, well, he said, it is in my hair, but he said, you see, my hair has never been cut. And if my hair was cut, I would be weak like any other man. And she said, well, honey, why don't you just take a little nap, just relax a bit. Now, I think you're beginning to see something here. How can a guy be so stupid? I mean, don't you think he'd catch on? I mean, every time he tells her something, he wakes up and here it is. You know, how can you be so dumb? But you know what? I'm amazed when a person gets caught in sin, when a man is controlled by his own lust, the foolish, ridiculous things that he will do, and how you seem to lose all sense of balance. It's tragic what sin will do to a person as far as just blinding them to reality, to the truth. And so as Samson went to sleep, she called in the Philistines. They shaved his head. She said, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And he jumped up. And that very tragic verse of Scripture, he knew not that the Spirit of God had departed from him. He said, I'll go out as other times. But there was no strength. The Philistines took him. They wrestled him to the ground. One took a stick, gouged out his eyes. They bound him with chains of brass, and they led him as a captive down to the Philistine city of Gaza. And there, they put him on the mill. An ox usually pulled the post around the millstone in the circle, and the ladies would put their wheat in to grind it. And they made Samson do the work of an ox every day, day after day, just pushing this millstone around while the ladies would grind their flour. What a picture of what sin does to a person. Blinds them. They gouged out his eyes. They bound him with chains of brass. And sin can really bind a person. And then grinding. You know, no longer is a pleasure, but sin becomes a real grind to you after a while. And so we see Samson in that condition. That's not the end of the story. It said his hair began to grow again. Now, you'd think of this, Philistines were wise, they'd send the barber in every day. But his hair began to grow again. And so the Philistines there in Gaza worshipped Dagon, the fish god. And they had a big holiday for Dagon, and they were gathered in the temple, some 3,000 of them. And someone got the bright idea, bring Samson in. He used to be such a nemesis to us, and let's just, make sport of him. So they brought Samson in to sort of just make sport of him. They knew he was blind, and so let him come in and just sort of feel his way around, trip him, and let him bump into things, and just gales of laughter going up from the places. Poor old Samson, helpless, and just watching his folly there. Samson said to the little boy who was the one to lead him around, he said, would you leave me over? He said, I need to rest against the pillars that hold up this place. So the little boy led him over to the pillars, and Samson took hold of them. He prayed and he said, God, made a mess of my life, really blown it. But just once more, I'd like to experience the power of your Spirit upon me. And Lord, I want to be avenged of my eyes on these Philistines. And Lord, just let me die with them. And the Spirit of God came upon him, and he pulled the pillars together. The temple came crashing down. 3,000 Philistines were crushed to death. And underneath of them all, Samson, the man who could have been one of the greatest heroes in the history of Israel. The man who should have been a tremendous power for God, but a man who never did gain the potential that he had because he could not conquer his own lust. It was his lust that got him into trouble every time. He could conquer 1,000 Philistines with a jawbone of a donkey, but he couldn't conquer his own lust, and his lust ultimately led to his demise. The story of Samson is a very important story because it isn't restricted or limited to an event that happened here 3,000 years ago. The story of Samson, unfortunately, is being repeated over and over again almost every day. We see people that have great potential. We see people who have the anointing and power of God upon their lives. We see people that can be and could be a great giant for God and the things of God, but we see their lives being wasted, their lives being destroyed because they can't conquer their own flesh. The potential that is wasted today is tragic indeed. A while back I was called by a mother asking me to go over to the Orange County Hospital and visit her daughter who was in the psychiatric ward. And she explained to me how her daughter had gotten some acid, freaked out, and how that she had to be put into the padded cell over in the psychiatric ward at Orange County Hospital. Would I visit her? And I assured her that I would, and so I went over, and the nurse let me in, took me down the hallway, unlocked the girl's door. And I went in, and there on the bed I saw one of the prettiest high school girls you could ever hope to see, just a beautiful, pretty young girl. And I said, "Hi, is your name?" And I called her by her name that her mom gave me, and she said, "Yeah." She said, "Are you Chuck?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, "Well, your mom said you were going to come, and thank you for coming. It's awfully nice of you to come." And so I started talking to her about Laguna Beach High School because she was the beauty queen there that year at the school, and she was one of the cheerleaders. Very pleasant girl, sweetest smile. And as we just sort of chatted for a while, I finally got around to the reason why I was there, and I asked her, about the Lord. I began to share with her about Jesus Christ and about how many kids were at the church that had been messed up with drugs and how God was working in their lives. And so I said, wouldn't you like to accept the Lord? Now, the thing was, we'd been contacted by the chief of police in Laguna, and he had asked us if we would come down to Laguna High. They estimated that at that particular time, Timothy Leary was in the canyon. At that particular time, they estimated that 90% of the kids sitting in the Laguna High School classrooms were stoned. And they really couldn't conduct classes. And they wondered if we could come down because they had heard what had happened at Estancion, Newport, and the high schools around Costa Mesa. And he asked if we couldn't come down to Laguna Beach and maybe deal with the kids down there. And in each case, we sort of needed a kid to get in to the kids. And as I was talking to this gal, I thought, here is the key. She's a beautiful girl. She's the queen of the high school. And, if we can get her the open door, and I was sure that the Lord was just opening up the door to Laguna High, and I was really excited. And as I said, wouldn't you like to just accept the Lord? And she smiled and said, no. She said, Chuck, I appreciate your coming. It's very kind of you. And I know you didn't have to. And I know my mom asked you to. But she said, what I did the other night was the most stupid thing possible. And she said, I paid the price for it. She said, I would never touch drugs again as long as I live. That was just plain dumb and stupid of me. And I learned my lesson. And so I really don't think I need the Lord. And so I went on and said, hey, it's just not, the Lord is just, to get you out of drugs. The life in Christ is a glorious life. And I went on to share with her some more. And I came back around and I said, wouldn't you like to accept Jesus? She said, no. Maybe some other time, but I don't think I'm ready. It was about 9 years later that I got a call from her mother again asking me if I would meet with her daughter once again. And I thought, 18, 27, I bet she's a real beauty now. And I told the mother, sure, and we set a date for her to bring her daughter in. And my secretary called and said, your appointment's here. I went out, saw her mother, and sitting next to her mother, I saw this gal. And she weighed close to 300 pounds. Her eyes had the blank stare that said nobody's home. Her face was all blotched. Her mother had to help her to her feet, had to help her into the office, help her down into a chair. Her mother said, I'll leave the two of you. And I said, what happened? And she smiled. She said, oh, I'm fine now. I live in a house in Orange. It's a care house, and I can sit on a porch, and I watch cars go by, and it's nice there. And it was like someone was taking my heart and just ripping it out. I thought the potential. The rest of her life, sitting on a rocking chair on a porch watching cars go by. The potential down the tubes. And the wasted life. And I thought, she should be a beautiful mother. She should be having children. She should be enjoying life. And instead, she's sitting there on a porch watching cars go by. And I thought of the story of Samson. What was the secret of Samson's strength? Don't tell me it was his long hair. It wasn't. The long hair represented his consecration to God. And that's the secret of strength in anybody's life. When you're really consecrated